Hi, I'm Kara, and today I'm going to talk about the missing piece in solving complex problems. My guess is that in whatever area that you work in, you on a day to day basis deal with solving complex problems. And so I hope this is really helpful to you. Now, my background, just really briefly, is I started out in geopolitics and then I taught yoga full time and was coaching high performing women. And then I now work in organizations looking at change management and helping people lead and adapt to change. And in all of these contexts, I find that across the board, we tend to look at problems in isolation. And I think the missing piece in solving complex problems is taking a more holistic view of the context in which the problem exists. Because the problem that we see is often the symptom. To understand the problem and its full complexity and also to be able to resolve it, we have to look at the systems around it and the context in which it exists. For example, in organizations that are undergoing change, which is pretty much every organization. There's always change happening everywhere in every way. Some changes are more structured and planned than others. But if we want to look at, say, change resistance in an organization, if people are resisting change, if they're really unhappy about a change and maybe not wanting to adopt, say, a new system or really pushing back against culture changes or organizational restructures, we have to look at the system in which people are operating. It's usually not that people are just trying to be problematic, right? So to understand the problem, which in this case is the change resistance, we need to look at the organizational context and perhaps further as well. We want to ask questions like, okay, well, if a lot of people are pushing back against the change or resisting this new system, for example, why is that? Again, it's usually, no one loves change, but we push back against change that doesn't make sense, right? So have we communicated the change properly? Have we communicated the benefits of the change properly? Why we're doing it? Why they should care about it? Why it's important to our shared values, which might be, for example, the impact that we make on our clients. And this change enables us to do our jobs with even more impact. We also have to look at the context, and this gets missed so much is because there is so much change in every organization. People are exhausted. There's only so much change that we have the capacity to handle, and people are also trying to do their day-to-day jobs. So again, it's not saying that we shouldn't make change, but we really have to understand the organizational context in order to effectively make change. If we're making a change in the midst of say to a finance system right at end of financial year while they're also undergoing a restructure and they're getting a new director in, that's a lot of change for one team to handle. Or maybe there's been a series of restructures for this particular team that you're bringing into your area. And if we don't understand that, then it's going to be really hard for us to understand and solve this, problem or symptom that we see, which is change resistance or resistance to whatever change we're trying to roll out. We have to understand the context in more depth. And I think we actually need to look beyond the organization. In most organizational change is that, look, change fatigue is a real thing in organizations. People are exhausted with the series of change that is constantly coming to them. And we have to look at our day-to-day lives. The amount of change and just the fast pace of our environment has an impact on everyone and how we're able to show up and how much capacity we have left for additional change that people want to roll out in an organization. So if you're in a change leadership or in a leadership position, it's really important to understand how can we prioritize change? Can we tie certain changes together so that they're more effective in being rolled out to minimize the impact on people? Can we space them out in new ways? Is this change actually really necessary, or can we hold off on it because it's going to be too disruptive on people? And looking at the social and cultural aspects of the pace of everyday life. Or of course, during the pandemic, there was so much change in that space and people having to adapt to so much change outside of work. So The symptom might be change resistance, but to understand the problem and to solve said problem or obstacle effectively, we have to understand not just the individual, we have to understand the team context, the organizational context, the social and cultural context, and potentially global. I mean, we have a lot of global events going on that affect people quite personally. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't roll out change, but it's really important to understand what impacts more broadly are going on that will affect people in your team, in your organization as well. Now, this is the same with change at, say, social or global levels. If we look at, say, mental health, and we have arguably a crisis of burnout and mental health challenges such as anxiety and depression, yes, it's very, very important to treat the individual. Therapy, big fan. And we cannot isolate individual well-being from collective well-being. We cannot isolate an individual's health from the community and from the context in which they live. And I say this many times, but you can't breathwork your way out of a cost of living crisis. You can't cognitive behavioral therapy your way out of a housing crisis or out of losing your job. Yes, there might be ways where we can manage that a little bit better, but overall, if we're looking at social crises like burnout, we actually have to question the systems and structures that we live within that perpetuate and encourage this, say, behaviors or paces of life that actually lead to these outcomes or obligations. People aren't choosing usually to burn out. It's because of the various obligations and requirements that we have of us that are either financially or socially expected of us. And yes, sometimes it's the pressure we put on ourselves, and it's also boundaries. It's both individual and social and cultural and systems and structures that we have to look at. And this really hit home when I was working with a lot of ambitious and high-performing women, is that so many people, and I worked with women, so I'm going to say women, but people in general are experiencing burnout. And it's not a choice, but with the cost of living, and if people have children, and if people are, working hard to support their families, there's so much pressure on the go, 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 go. There's very little time for rest. There's very little time to recharge, and there's very little time for what people call well-being, but I think are actually just foundations of general health, like, good sleep, having time for movement, having time to eat well, having time with family and community, and increasingly our pace of life and the requirements that our, say, the economy put on people around working means that we actually lose so much touch with community. And so many studies show the importance of community to longevity, to health, to mental health. And so, again, say mental health is something that I'm particularly passionate about, have a lot of personal experience in this space. Yes, we need to treat it on an individual level, but we cannot look at mental health without understanding social, cultural, systemic, and global level impacts as well, and influences. And arguably this is the same if we're looking, say, at global or social levels and problems that sit at those levels. For example, with radicalization, there are a lot of studies in this and people who know way more than me about this, but we have to be able to look at, say, what causes people to be radicalized in whatever way that looks. And it's not just looking at the individual, it's looking at the social, cultural, systemic factors that might drive people towards that kind of behavior, and towards those kind of communities. And I think some studies I'd need to check, but in terms of, say, not having a community and feeling isolated, radical groups often offer a sense of community and belonging that people very deeply need for well-being. And so that's one factor that I know has been researched and has been explored to understand how that factors into the extent to which people are able to be radicalized by these groups. And the same thing is, say, political trends and We had waves of populism rising through Europe, or I won't go too much into this space, but understanding as well the individual level fears and genuine concerns that are actually rising up and then become and contribute to these big social trends that influence entire voting patterns and democracies. And so, again, we can't necessarily look at these global changes without understanding the individual um, psychologies that contribute to this politics of fear, how vulnerable people might be to misinformation, and what it is that they're really wanting, and what different candidates actually offer them. And so the main takeaway from this is that if you are looking at solving big problems, complex problems, whether it be in your organization, as a startup, as an entrepreneur, in your business, as an individual, in your community, as a volunteer, whatever that looks like to you, I just encourage you to see, okay, if the symptom and the problem that we're identifying, what level does that sit at? Individual, social, cultural, systemic, global? Where does it sit at? And wherever it sits, what other influences at different levels might be at play here? How might, say, the systems in which we exist influence how the individual is behaving? Or how might individual elements impact culture or global trends that we're seeing? So I just encourage you to take that away with you into whatever space you're working in. And if you're open to sharing what that might look like in your space, I'd be really excited to hear about that, because I think it's just so applicable and so exciting to see how we can all just look at problems in a more holistic way to understand them, and then ideally to be able to, once we put them in context, we have so much more ability to understand and then take concrete, tangible steps towards resolving them in more meaningful ways. So I hope this has been helpful, and if you're willing to share any of your experiences, I'd love to hear from you.